Hello everyone and welcome. Welcome to our session about renewable energy and renewed hope, serving the people and the planet. My name is Gosia Rychlik and I'm the branch manager of Climate Reality Project Europe, a European branch of an organization, climate nonprofit founded by Al Gore. So today we're going to talk about how renewables can actually not only help us decarbonize, but also help us build a society that has access to affordable energy, clean energy, safe energy. So before we start, I wanted to have a show of hands about whether you think that we already figured out how to implement renewables. Do you think that we already know how to do this successfully? If you agree, raise your hand. That's a fair bit of people, and our panel discussion speakers are very convinced that we do, so that's great. And then those who are not exactly convinced and think that we still are trying to figure it out, raise your hand. Okay, that's a few people. So let's see about our session today. Just a quick announcement. Luca Chancel, who was the keynote speaker for this session, could not make this time, unfortunately. So we're going to start away with the panel discussion. So let me invite our speakers to the stage. So Sonja de Ruiter from Triodos Investment Management, Craig Douglas from World Fund VC, and Perine Fleury from Biotech Solar. So, hello everyone. How are you feeling today? All good, all good. So we had a small change here, but we're going to start right away with our discussion. And so maybe first, I would like to hear just a few words about you. What do you do? What are you excited about when it comes to your work? Just to help us set the scene here.
So it's on. Okay, so my name is Sonja de Ruiter. I work for Triodos. So we have the bank, of course, the sustainable bank, and I work for the investment side. So on a daily basis, I'm investing in the energy transition on behalf of our investors. And I'm super excited to be in something that's changing so much. And often people think of it as the problems coming with the energy transition, but I think there are many, many solutions. You also see it here. So yeah, that's exciting me.
Greg?
Hello everyone, I'm Craig Douglas, one of the founding partners of World Fund. We're a climate tech venture capital fund looking for companies that have the largest decarbonization potential. Maybe a little like what gets me excited, what gets me are the solutions that work today and can be scaled today as quick or in the very short term to be able to make the largest possible impact. And maybe a little 10 seconds on me. Like I have a technical background, physics, chemistry, energy consultancy, and a long time, now 15 years in the venture space. And I also advise the European Commission on energy policy.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Perine. I'm from Biosphere Solar, and we have developed a solar panel that is circular, so it is modular, can be taken apart. And our work is focused on the hardware side, but I think one of the reasons also that I'm here today is because we also started this company with the idea that we want to bring a bit of a breath of fresh air to the energy sphere and to the solar industry, which direly needs it actually at the moment. And we really envision a world where we can move towards not just having solar energy replacing the old energy system of fossil fuels, but also changing the way in which we work, in which we do business, in which we live our lives.
Thank you so much.
In short.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. But we'll of course explore a bit more as we speak. So at the beginning, when I was thinking about our session, I thought that there's definitely the opportunity that we're having right now to think about how to design the energy system in a different way that the fossil fuels basically rolled out. So we now can think about how can we actually impact the planet, how we can impact the people, how we can shape society, as you just mentioned. So what do you think, what are the mistakes that we shouldn't repeat? What should we do to not repeat the same mistakes of the fossil fuel-based energy infrastructure?
Yeah, I can start and take that one. I think a key mistake that I'm sure a lot of people in the room already know is that we, in the fossil industry, what we did was centralize energy access. And so our entire grids are also very much, you can also tell us a little bit more about that, Craig. We've really designed our society to have central pillars that then provide energy to the rest of the nation. And with solar and renewables, you have the opportunity to decentralize enormously energy sources. And I think, for me, that is the one thing that I will say is a big mistake that we should not make again. Maybe you'd like
I'm more looking at it as kind of, rather than mistakes, look at it as what opportunities there are there,
That's
right?
the way to phrase it, yes.
So rather than mistakes, where the existing energy infrastructure is all built around OPEX, it costs you to produce energy, we're moving entirely more onto where you're putting in assets where you basically have zero marginal cost. So when you're doing that, you need to be thinking about, okay, how is that going to fundamentally change how energy is produced, what the price of energy is, when is it going to be the most abundant? Because you don't actually have a choice about when the energy is going to be made, like you did in the fossil fuel-based system. So you need to try and make the system more connected, more inclusive, as much as possible, because if you can do that, then you're going to lower the cost for everyone, and it allows everyone to actually be engaged. So everyone can become a prosumer, everyone can choose when they charge their car, everyone can choose when they're going to be using their energy. And if you can do that, then I think there's a real opportunity to make the energy system more robust, but also a hell of a lot cheaper, hopefully.
Yeah, and maybe to add to it, decentralization, of course, you might see it as a mistake, but also a logical consequence of the energy use. So if you use fossil fuels, then you go from one way to the other. It's very linear. But what we overlooked, and we're confronted with it today, is, of course, the independence on other countries. And that we cannot set the price ourselves. We are now dragged into another oil war. We saw it with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and maybe we thought it was a wake-up call. We saw prices increase. We actually saw for the first time people also realizing this dependency and that energy is across our whole system. So also the underestimation that energy is the backbone of our whole economy, I think is one of the bigger mistakes, and we learned the hard way with all the inflation coming our way. Unfortunately, it didn't really cause a change, and now we have another wake-up call. And the question is, how many wake-up calls do we need?
It seems
if
like
I would
more
have to
than
pick
one.
one big mistake,
Yeah, it seems that more than one. I just saw some social media posts about how wind and solar don't get stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. So that's an element of that, definitely. So now we did talk about the decentralization. So it, of course, brings such an opportunity for communities, individuals, and buildings to create their own energy. But that definitely creates some challenges as well, right? I mean, we have to move from a centralized system into a decentralized system, a distributed one. Of course, it brings this opportunity, I would even say, of democratizing the energy system. But then, how do we actually do this? We're still so centralized. How do we actually become more distributed? And what are the challenges when it comes to that? And how do we face them?
Yeah, so of course it's a huge challenge, and we shouldn't forget that it's a transition. So also the problems we see are mainly because we stick the new energy system on the old one, and then we're saying, hey, it doesn't work, which makes perfect sense. So what we always like to say, hey, you centralize what you need to centralize. So for offshore energy, it makes sense that you bring it to a point and start distributing from there. But we very much believe in decentralizing where possible, and you see a lot of those cases already. And also actually because of grid congestion, because we have a lot of grid congestion in the Netherlands, which causes companies which cannot connect to the grid anymore. So they have to be creative. So they have problems, and then they find a solution. So windmills are directly connected to, for example, charging for EV vehicles instead of first connecting it to the grid and then bring it back to charging vehicles. So you see many of those innovations actually on a day-to-day basis, and they are investable, I would say. There is a business case for it. Yeah.
And if I can just add to that, if there's any policymakers in the room, I think policy really goes hand in hand with that, because we really need to restructure our policies to ensure that we can decentralize.
That's such a good point, and I'm thinking about Craig right away.
It's interesting, like just making everything even, I think would be enough. Like just to get started. I mean, at the moment, a lot of things, like everyone heard about the massive outages in Spain and Portugal that ended up going into France. That actually the primary cause of that was that renewables weren't allowed to participate in grid stabilization because it was still seen as, they're the risky assets, we're only going to use fossil fuels. Like those are the ones that are going to give us grid stability. And then they wonder why, there were only 2% of the grid was being produced by fossil fuels at the time. The rest of it was renewables, and they wonder why they had grid stability issues, right? I mean, what do you expect to happen? So just to start with, trying to make it so that anyone who can be involved can actually be involved, and you don't have to be a certain size or be a certain type. If you can provide a service, if you can provide that flexibility, if you could provide anything that the grid actually needs, that should be open and access to anyone who can provide that service. And I'm a firm believer of markets. So from my perspective, the best way to incentivize this is to create local markets, local flexibility markets, local demand markets. Because as soon as you do that, people will respond to price signals. And particularly in the age where everything is being automated, a lot of those solutions can actually be solved by market mechanisms if you allow a market to be done on a local level, not just on a central level.
And just thinking about the connectedness of policy and markets, I mean, you did have an experience of consulting the European Commission and the UK government. How does that work? Where are the challenges, bottlenecks, and, well, there's probably a long conversation, but if you could summarize that.
I mean, different people have different focuses. One of the big ones, which I think you'll appreciate, is access to energy infrastructure at the moment. So getting your grid connection, how long it takes, why is it a problem, what are the conditions by which you can actually get your grid connection? That's number one, because grids are notoriously conservative, rightly so, because we don't want our electricity to go off, right? But just being able to know what is going to be possible in a location and the timeline or the conditions by which you can have access would allow them to use different solutions that would then enable them to use the rest of it.
Yeah, maybe as a concrete example, which might be recognizable for people with solar panels on their roof. So the grid is of course, and all our pricing incentives, they're built for a one-way street. So you produce and you use, and these days you become from only a consumer, you can also become a producer. But actually these days you are not incentivized to feed it back into the grid once you don't need it, because there's extra costs for it. So there's two-way costs. You have to pay for getting the energy and for recharging it to the grid. And there is, of course, a long discussion already on how to reshape these kind of... It's getting very sunny.
Pretty sunny.
This is good for the energy transition.
Yes.
So now there are a lot of discussions about how to reshape these incentives, to change behavior also. And one I also always have to think of, back in the days, you always got incentivized to do your laundry at night. I always remember that my parents were using electricity at night, which is of course completely outdated with the sun shining. So we need to find ways with maybe lower prices during the day or different incentives, software, to change behavior. And policy can help in that.
Yeah.
And maybe if we don't, there is a danger that you create the wrong incentives for people. I mean, we had this discussion. If you don't create an even playing field, there's actually an incentive, particularly for consumers, when they become prosumers, to basically go off grid.
Exactly.
Right? If you can, you would, because the cost benefit of paying for a grid connection versus consuming everything yourself just doesn't make sense at the moment. And like, if you do that, then, and that becomes a widespread thing that people do, the grid costs get attributed to a smaller and smaller part of the population. Like, and typically the people who don't have a 3-bedroom house in a field and can afford batteries, right? So like, there is, if we don't do this, there are unintended consequences for society, not just for energy.
And that actually makes me think about how we actually focused on European conditions, right? But that off-grid situation is also applicable to Global South, right? Where lack of energy access becomes, you know, kind of my own solar panels, for example, right? So I was wondering if you have any examples of how this can be actually implemented in the Global South.
Yeah, so we also, with Triodos Investment Management, we also invest quite a lot in emerging markets. And we mostly do that via microfinance. And what that means is that we also provide specific green loans. So those loans are used for actually very much decentralized solar systems so that people can just charge their phone, or they have lights so that kids can do their homework. So they basically go from no access to energy to access to energy. So it's a completely different transition that we are going through, of course. Yeah.
And I do want to say, little disclaimer, I'm a bit of a newbie in this field, but I do, our company is working in Nigeria, India, and Indonesia at the moment, or starting to. And what we are seeing is that the opportunities are very different to here. So we're not faced, in a lot of these places, we're not faced with the problem of trying to keep the grid alive, because in most of these places there is no grid to keep alive. And I think that is an immense opportunity for the Global South to not make the same mistakes that we did, because we were so dependent on, and it makes sense that we were so dependent on an oil system. But in short, wanting to say that it's a huge opportunity to bypass these mistakes that we did, that we go towards renewable energy systems.
Yeah, and we've seen some really interesting companies that are actively doing this, and it's not just in generation, but in utilization as well. So one of the founders that I backed in my previous fund ended up exiting very successfully, and he went back to Ghana, where he grew up, and founded a company that was focused on electric motorbikes. And he does battery swapping for them, and that battery plus the electric motorbike means that it's actually cheaper than using gasoline, right? That's a solution that's going to mean that there doesn't need to be a huge amount of non-electric vehicles on the road. Interesting also, that battery can then be used in a home environment for charging your devices at home or running things at home. So that leapfrog, that you don't then need a grid architecture necessarily in the same way, and the cost structures behind that, the benefit is so enormous that you're not dependent on fossil fuels. You have a stable cost and a very, very predictable infrastructure as a result.
I wonder if, I was just thinking about the examples that you shared, and I'm wondering if we could let our imagination a bit loose and think about how the world would look like when it all happens, actually, right? With all the technologies that you invest in currently, and the startups that you know, and all the innovation that you see every day in your work, I wonder how our days would look differently. Like how would we feel it if it actually happens that we go full renewable or full of grid, maybe even, right?
Okay, can I start by saying, hopefully you wouldn't feel it at all.
I want to say the same, actually, yeah.
Yeah, the whole idea is that no one needs to even think about this because it all happens in the background. So when there's a massive increase in solar locally, that automatically gets chucked into batteries or electric vehicles or into people's heating or cooling solutions. And that doesn't require anyone to do anything. It's entirely orchestrated autonomously, right? And by doing that, not only do I not care about it, but actually when there's a surge in supply, I can do that more cheaply than I can do today, right?
Yeah, and what you will, and that we don't know, of course, but the price will change. So if you have an energy system that's fully run on renewables, which is available all the time, then that will definitely put pressure on the price positively for consumers. And from an investment perspective, that requires different business models to take into account. But for consumers, for us, it will be a difference for your energy bill, I guess. Yeah.
I love this because I am very far from
Finance,
from thinking that. Actually, I think I understand and respect the mindset, but I really am on the total opposite side of thinking we have an immense opportunity for changing the way we live right now. We've been stuck in a system that for the past 80, 100 years has been continuously growing and growing and growing. And I know we don't want to get into the whole capitalist discussion, but I do think that the renewable energy transition or the energy transition is a bit of a, it's an immense opportunity for also allowing individuals like you and I to rethink how we live our lives and to rethink whether we want to continuously be working a 9-to-5 job that is following the same structure that we've had in place for the past 50 years, and to instead move towards, for example, living more with the seasons or living more with the sun and changing our habits. And so, yes, potentially we won't feel it, you and I, but I really hope that we do, because this will be a wake-up call, another one of those wake-up calls for us to be like, actually, there's so much opportunity in changing the way we live today.
That's such an interesting perspective, because I know that people actually don't like change that much, so they would actually prefer if we didn't feel it at all. But then at the same time, I think there's so much opportunity in that we actually have some sort of reflection, even subconsciously, that things are different now, and maybe we can actually start living differently. So I really like that. Yeah, Craig?
But even if you're really, like, I'm massively geeky about this. I have a solar system, battery, heat pump, like everything, and I play with it all the time, and there's optimization scripts and all the rest of it. And my fellow partner, Tim, who is a software, like, he grew up doing software development, serial entrepreneur, software developer, put on PV decades ago, and he said, I played with it for like 2 weeks, and then maybe open it up once a year to figure out how much money I've made, right? Like, we have to accept that we are not the norm, right? In terms of how much we're really into this stuff. And even people who are really into it, once it's kind of running, just leave it like they don't care anymore. So the system, I think we have to design a system by which that has to be the assumption, and I would love for it to be different. Right? But we can't assume that people are going to change. We have to create the system by which you either incentivize change or you automate change, or automate inclusion, right?
That's very pragmatic, but I think so. Perine, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree on that we cannot assume that everyone will change, and I totally agree. But I also think that we are amongst the very privileged to be able to not think about our energy use and about the way that we live our life and our relationship to electricity, for example. And I think there are many more people that don't have that privilege. And I do think that the goal as a society, we shouldn't, when we're talking about envisioning the future and trying to envision a better society, we shouldn't be trying to bring everyone to the level or to the state of not being aware of our energy consumption, which is currently what I think is a big trend and what we're aiming towards as a society. But we should be meeting a little bit more in the middle of still remaining aware of and grateful also for the fact that we can now turn freaking solar into electricity, into this, and really stay grateful and conscious of that transition that needs to happen.
So there's maybe a middle there to still be conscious of how much energy we use, actually, so we don't overuse it all the time. I mean, it's maybe a bit hard to imagine that if we can have almost unlimited energy, but I can definitely see that as part of the sustainability angle of that conversation, which I would like to head into, but I just want to check, Greg, if you wanted to.
The cost standpoint, I think, is a really important one, and you're absolutely right. We are exceptionally privileged to not have to care about our energy price. Right? Like we don't, for the most part. But those that do really, really care about it, right? It's a huge proportion of your disposable income. Deciding whether you're going to put your house at 18 degrees or 17 degrees can fundamentally change your outlook or change your temperature of your home, but decides potentially what your disposable income is going to be for that week. you need to make sure that the energy system doesn't leave those people behind. And the more you can include that in, the better, because those are the people who actually have the desire, the demand, the need to be included, because they're the ones that will feel the potential of that lower energy price the most keenly. They're also the people that are most likely to shift demand according to price as well. But it shouldn't all be about price. I appreciate that.
Thank you. So I'm actually thinking of heading into the sustainability bit as well, because we covered the social angles, and I'm really curious about the environmental one, since and I'm looking at Perine right away, because, but of course it's open to all of you, but since you work in a company that created a fully recyclable solar, I'm thinking about, well, how do we approach the environmental cost of transitioning to renewable energy, since this is actually one of the arguments that people against the transition use, that this is not a saint technology, right? It has its drawbacks. So I wonder, how do we approach that? And if we can talk a little bit more about what sustainability is in long term.
Yeah, another massive disclaimer that solar and renewables are by far so much more sustainable than any fossil-based energy source. It's really something that I want to stress. In our company, we're working on making solar panels more circular. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't install solar panels now because they're not yet perfect. I think that's also a question that I often get. Oh, but should I not be installing solar panels now? No, you definitely should. Having said that, I think what I was saying earlier is definitely anchored in this also realization that we cannot make everything 100% circular, and we cannot make everything sustainable as far as we want it to be. And I think we are very ambitious in this field and in this sphere and in this building, but we also have to work with the reality that there are just some limitations to what we can do. And I think that's also where my perspective of we also need to shift a little bit the way that we treat and the way that we relate to energy, because if we constantly just think it's an endless source of energy, we're not going to achieve the targets that we've set for ourselves.
Yeah, so maybe to add to that, because also for Triodos, this is a big topic, of course, because we don't want to create new problems. That's basically what you try to do, but you have to take into account the reality. So some concrete examples how we do it. So battery storage is, of course, one of our bigger investment themes. And we do know that there are quite a lot of batteries with cobalt, but there we're just saying that's a no-go. We're not taking this material from conflict areas, and we're only taking lithium-ion batteries. And also very recently, we invested together with Voltvang and Ice Creek in actually a very nice project where we used repurposed battery cells from the car manufacturing sector, because they are just buying battery cells, as many as they think they need, but they sold less electric vehicles and they just buy too much anyway. And this company, they took these cells and they stacked them together into a large utility scale battery storage facility. And we finance it, and it's currently working in Germany. So that's one of the examples how you can use what's already there in the energy transition.
I'm also thinking about wind turbines. I think you did mention an example of wind turbines being repurposed, right?
Yeah, so another example. So we already started investing in renewable energies in the early 80s, actually. And also we have wind farms in our portfolio from the 90s. And we start repowering those. So that basically means that we are putting newer, larger turbines on the same location. But of course, we have to do something with the old turbines, and it's known that it's hard to recycle, especially the blades, because they're glued together. So you probably have seen examples of those blades just laying around. And there's actually also a stand here who's also recycling wind turbines, so it's nice to pass by. But what we did is we really tried to challenge also the developer to recycle it fully. And then they found this small company, and they shattered basically the blades into very small pieces, and they put it together back into crane mats. So what you see in construction areas, you often see if there's cranes, they need to be on a very heavy mat, because otherwise the lifting doesn't work. And that's usually tropical wood. So this wood is now being replaced with shredded blades from an old wind turbine. So here we really try to connect different industries who all have a sustainability target, so to say.
That's really great because it's solving two problems at the same time, and I really appreciate it so much. And I think that that's something we will need more of, is that creativity of solving problems. Actually, it's amazing if it actually can happen that we solve two at the time or even more, and we actually think of a broader system and how we can support the system. I wasn't sure if Greg, you want to add anything to that?
I mean, more like when we make investments, we only look at companies that fit in our view of what we consider a regenerative world, right? So what does that look like in the future? So for example, we won't make investments, or we haven't made investments in any company that's making animal agriculture more efficient. Whilst we love the idea and it would definitely meet our climate targets, we'd prefer to invest in alternative proteins instead. But that also is true for things like you can create lock-ins as well. So just because you think you've got the best technology now, you need to make sure that you've not fundamentally, like making a slightly better internal combustion engine. Yeah, it would meet a climate target, but what you've just done is potentially locked in that asset for the next 20 years, and that asset, in effect, has no decarbonization route anymore. So we'll always look at it, what are the negative consequences of our investments, or what are the potential negative consequences of our investments? And with the solar one, the recycling is a real one, right? Batteries, it's a real one. That's why one of our portfolio companies is the world leader in battery recycling, right? Because we believe that without that solution, we are going to cause problems. And actually, if you do that solution right, you actually not just solve the problems, but you solve the supply chain as well. So, you know, the solutions do create problems, but often those problems also help to drive the solutions in the future.
Yeah, and I think it serves the human creativity. I mean, we still need to use our brains in the age of AI, right? And I hope that that will continue. And I was also wondering, there's an environmental aspect, but there's also an aspect of where these materials are sourced. And I'm just thinking about, you know, some of the materials that are well sourced in horrible conditions, that where children are employed in terrible conditions. I wonder, how do we go about that as well? And maybe do you fund any such companies that have a more sustainable profile here, so that it's not only about the recycling and the use after, but the before is sustainable as well, and that this transition is actually truly sustainable, as in just transition, right? Which is also a whole conversation topic. I wonder if any of you have an experience with companies like that, or new approaches to this, or does it seem to be still a pending problem that we don't have answers to?
So for us, it's a bit similar. So we don't fund the companies, but the projects. We really invest in the hardware of the energy transition. And it's also often it's about asking the question. So if you don't start the conversation, it's similar with the example of the wind turbine. You need to be the one asking the question and starting the discussion on where does the material actually come from, and put your standards also there. And then you can steer the change. So we've seen that in the solar industry already, where there was a huge discussion on solar panels from China and Uyghur, I don't know the English word actually, but the region, and it actually caused a lot of discussion in the industry. And once we source solar panels, we want the manufacturers to confirm that there's no slavery involved, that there's no child labor involved. So that's the way we work. So I would say for everyone, you need to ask that question in the first place.
Standards and questions.
As an industry in the solar industry, as a company in the solar industry, this is a really big one for us, because we are directly manufacturing solar panels in China and the Netherlands, and so it's the conflict in the Xinjiang region is definitely a big topic, and I think I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think what you just said about initiating the dialogue is really, really key. And that's also what we're working on. We're in China right now, initiating dialogues, trying to understand also the different perspectives, because we also have to acknowledge that we have a very by we have a we have a way of looking at the world. The Western world has a way of looking at the rest of the world and implementing our own mindset and our own solutions and thinking that that's the way we should go. And I think we really need to be careful not to follow not to go into neocolonialism basically and think that this is something that we can repeat in the solar industry as well. But there's no easy answer, and it's ongoing challenges.
Yes. Okay, but I really like the fact that we can acknowledge that as well. And I'm actually going back to the beginning of the session when I asked the question whether the audience feels that we're ready when it comes to the implementation of renewables and we know how to do it. And there were some people who agreed with that, and then you were the ones who were the loudest in that. So I'm just curious about what makes you feel so confident about it.
So in general, for the energy transition, I think the technology is here. So we know what to do, we know how to do it, but it's more about having the policies in place, the incentives in place to make it happen. So the problem is not the technology, I would say. For the example I also just gave with grid costs, it's more about what business models do we apply to make it happen and to change the behavior more than the challenge on the technology side.
In terms of getting the grid to like 90% decarbonized, I'd 100% agree. We have the technologies, we have the costs, we know where the costs are, we know where the barriers are, and we have a very good understanding of what could be done to fix them. If you want to go that last 5-10%, there's some other stuff that needs to be done. And there's some other technologies that need to be created, but also when we see hundreds of companies or thousands of companies a year, they are in the pipeline. And the other side of that is they need to be cost effective and they need to be able to fit into the architecture that we built. And there's a lot of steps that need to happen before that actually becomes the fundamental bottleneck. And there, we've got the technologies. We need to change it so that those technologies can be implemented at scale and everyone can get involved.
I mean, as someone in the solar industry, it's impossible not to see that this is already happening, that the change is already here, that it's only a matter of time before it, because economically it makes sense, technologically it makes sense, from a social perspective it makes sense. So for me it seems like a no-brainer to move towards this. And I'm also just with so much enthusiasm raising my hand that I think that I believe that the energy transition is happening and it's here, because I think to not believe in that would be to kind of give up on the idea that we can meet the targets that we have for a stable planet. And I think, we need all the enthusiasm and energy we can get to make it happen.
Yeah, maybe to add to it, so we started also within Triodos and many maybe people here, we started with climate change as the biggest driver, and we've noticed that's not appealing to everyone. At least not fast enough. So the price and the independence and the economic resilience that is at stake, that are definitely drivers that help bring more people on board, and at least governments. So we will keep moving, I would say.
To think that it's not going to happen, I'd go one step further. You don't believe in economics, right? You'd have to think that this is not going to happen, you would have to deny the existence of economic principles, right? Renewable and battery solutions today are the most cost-effective solution, right? It's not a case of choosing something else. Like, you can sell climate solutions, particularly energy climate solutions, to climate deniers, not because they care about the climate, but because they care about money. And that has switched. Like, last 5 years, we are there. It's about how can we get the system in place to be able to deliver on that mass adoption.
So this makes me think of the last question that I had, but I think I already know the answer. So even if we stripped all the climate targets, the transition would still make sense economically, right? I mean, we have all the basis for it. So actually, well, I don't think we need to even answer that. It answered itself. So actually, this is all for the panel now. Our time is running out, even though we had 10 more minutes. So we appreciated that for sure. So thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you all for listening to our panel discussion. And now we're going to move to a fireside chat. So thank you all again.